Welcome everybody. My name is Cathy Colborne and I'm chairing today's history seminar for colleagues, in particular standing in for Sasha Davis, who's at home but in the background there. So thanks very much, Sasha, for setting us up. And a quick note that we're recording this session and the recordings are published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle, which is a growing list of wonderful presentations. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located. And here in particular, pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging, in particular the Pambalong clan of the Awabakal people of the land on which the Callaghan campus of the University of Newcastle resides and where we're in the room we're in today. Before I just get started to introduce our wonderful speaker, who's our colleague Elizabeth Roberts-Pedersen, I just wanted to acknowledge for everybody that our history group this week is mourning the loss of our Emerita Professor Lyndall Ryan, who has been a wonderful, caring and esteemed colleague in research in history. So we know that she's watching over us as we conduct our research and discuss these topics in our seminars, and we'll think of her as we do that today. So thanks everybody. So our presenter today, Elizabeth Roberts-Pedersen, also known as Libby, is a senior lecturer in history at the University of Newcastle, and Libby is a wonderful colleague and a wonderful historian. Her research examines the history of psychiatry and medicine, as well as the history of warfare. She's the author of Freedom, Faction, Fame and Blood in 2010, a study of British foreign fighters in 3 European wars, and a forthcoming book called Making Mental Health, A Critical History. That book is an inquiry into the political states of psychiatry from the 19th century to the present and promises to be a really interesting work. And hot on the heels of that, Libby's also been working on a third book, on the concept of mental salvage in the Second World War and its aftermath, and that will appear with Cambridge University Press. So today I think we're going to be hearing from Libby from strands of the book that's forthcoming, but also the next book with Cambridge, I believe, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, Libby. And your paper today is titled Psychopolitics, Capitalism and the History of Mental Health. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Cathy. Thanks, Sasha, and hello, everyone. I also want to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Awabakal people today. And I also want to acknowledge the passing of Lyndall Ryan, scholar, activist, and for many of us here, an admired colleague who will be greatly missed. And I know hearts are heavy in the room and online today. Also, before I begin, just I suppose a content warning that as the topic suggests, I'll be discussing mental health and also briefly mentioning suicide, some scholarship on suicide prevention as well. So the talk I'm giving today is drawn from that forthcoming book that Cathy mentioned that comes out in a few months that is trying to be a critical history of psychiatry and mental health. And one of its central claims is that the discipline of psychiatry and the broader concept of mental health are intertwined in a dual clinical political project that gathered pace over the course of the 20th century as the professionalising field of psychiatry became useful to modern states, projects of public health and broader governance. And in that book, I use a thematic approach to try and highlight what I think are the decisive moments in that history that demonstrate the stakes of this clinical political intersection in Anglo-American contexts. So after some angst, I came up with the 6 themes you see on the slide. And my paper today is based most heavily on the last of these themes, which is markets. I think, though, it's probably helpful if I quickly address the 5 other themes for some context. So bear with me while I do that. The first theme, walls, as the title implies, covers the rise and fall of the asylum. That's a story that's been told many times, but I try and do this through the prism of the perpetual reform efforts that I argue reflected the fundamental and perhaps irrevocable dilemma of how to render what's an essentially carceral situation therapeutic. And I also argue that prisons and aged care facilities reproduce some of the paradoxes and tendencies of the asylums of old. In the second theme, cures, I deal with the rise of biological treatments for mental illness and the resulting biomedicalisation of psychiatry and adjacent disciplines, which is a story that runs most of the 20th century, but that really gathers pace after the discovery of antipsychotic agents in the decade after the end of the Second World War, and that culminates in the mass manufacture of psychopharmaceuticals that are prescribed by general practitioners for a whole spectrum of mental distress. The next two themes move away from strictly clinical spaces to consider the direct links between psychiatry, mental health, the nation state, and international governance. So states considers nations' growing interest in mental hygiene and mental health from the interwar period onwards as part of a broader interest in population health and its political implications. And I argue that this is fairly spectacularly accelerated by the Second World War. Universals, in some senses, continues that story and a focus on governance to look at attempts to globalise psychiatry and the concept of mental health, beginning with the various iterations of psychiatry in colonial settings, the place of psychiatry and ideas about mental health in post-war international health bodies like the World Health Organization. And I try and finish up with the relationship between psychiatry, mental health and decolonisation, and look at the contemporary work of various Indigenous clinicians. The final two themes are less concerned with such direct political uses and more with the effects of political developments on the practice of psychiatry and understandings of mental health. The fifth theme, discontents, surveys controversies within the American Psychiatric Association in the 1960s and 1970s over sexuality, gender, race, as well as the origins of mad activism and the psychiatric survival movement in this period. And I argue that in trying to undo the influence of psychoanalysis in the APA by insisting on the salience of the socio-political factors in the production of mental illness, the activism of this period in fact bolstered the standing of ostensibly apolitical biomedical psychiatry, which once again erased the salience of the socio-political. That leads me to markets, which I think is the most speculative aspect of the book, perhaps the least satisfactory, where I'm trying to say something sensible, vaguely sensible about psychiatry, mental illness and capitalism, and something, it's a theme that I felt sort of echoed through all the material that I had been reading. And I guess where I landed was, it seemed to me that the activists of the 1960s and 1970s who argued for the recognition of the impact of socio-political factors on mental health did so from an anti-authoritarian standpoint mostly. They used psychiatric concepts to paint mainstream society as mad, but their ultimate goal with these efforts, rhetorical efforts, was clinical reform. So challenges to diagnostic schemas, clinical language and therapeutic practice, initiatives that ultimately strengthened, as I said, the new biological psychiatry. Nevertheless, these socio-political commentaries demonstrated the possibility of mobilising psychiatric concepts as a means of broader critique. And so it occurred to me, and where I ended up, was that there is another iteration of this tendency that's sort of running parallel, but is perhaps slightly older, one with substantial roots that predates these discontents of the 1960s and 1970s, and that's the use of psychiatry and mental health ideas, concepts, terminology to characterise and critique capitalism itself. Now, let me say from the outset that while I draw on various Marxist or Marxist-adjacent interpretations to try and make this argument, this is not an exclusively Marxist analysis, nor am I arguing that psychiatric distress is exclusive to capitalist societies, as some, proponents of, there are proponents of that thesis. But I think, the history of Soviet psychiatry, anyone that's vaguely familiar with that would see that as, a bit of a nonsense. Instead, what I want to suggest is that the psychologized critiques that I'm going to cover here today share a conviction that capitalism is constituted beyond the abstract, and that its human effects are the result of human actions, and that theorising the psychic toll of these interactions is one way of measuring their consequences. So my analysis is in three parts. First, it considers the various formulations of a distinctively capitalist psychopolitics, of course not the only kind of psychopolitics, in which the psychic life of subjects, including their mental health, is positioned as irretrievably intertwined with and thus governed by the logic of the market. And second, it considers one instantiation of this via what I'll designate as the psychiatrisation of work, in particular the notion of burnout. And third, it considers the way new digital technologies might create new markets for mental health care. We'll see if we can get through all of that by 10:45. All right, now while psychopolitics is an interesting term, and you can find it in various places from, maybe the late 60s onwards, here I'm going to use it in the sense that the philosopher Byung-Chul Han uses it. His works, The Burnout Society and Psychopolitics, are bracing and heavily psychologized accounts of constrained subjectivity under neoliberalist late capitalism. In The Burnout Society, Han argues that rather than disciplinary subjects, we are now achievement subjects, creatures of endless striving, not so much selves as projects, caught in a forever recursion in which, he says, the achievement subject exploits itself until it burns out. In Psychopolitics, Han proposes that such allo-exploitation renders neoliberalism self-sustaining, and that this dynamic is strongly abetted by pervasive digital technologies that intervene, he says, in psychic processes in a prospective fashion, not merely surveilling the individual, but preemptively steering them towards the reproduction of neoliberalist logic. Now, Han argues in those two works that these formulations are the necessary revisions that have to be made to the Foucauldian notion of a biopolitical disciplinary society. But the scholarship that I'm going to survey here suggests to me that this is overstated, and that Han's formulations not only underplay Foucault's insights into the neoliberalist demands on the subject, but that both sit within a broader literature that theorises capitalism as producing a totalising relationship between the psyche and the market. Over time, however, and I think this is where there is some distorting effect that can make the lineage a little difficult to trace, is that the relationship has shifted from the overt depredations of industrial capitalism, which is sort of explicit on the surface, towards the complicity that is required by neoliberalism, from labouring under capitalism to an equally oppressing labouring with or alongside capitalism. So while an obvious starting point here is those attempted conciliations that some of you will know very well between Marx and Freud that characterise the interwar period, I think there are some important precursors worth rehearsing. First, there are the actual material effects of capitalism on the management of madness and the development of psychiatry and related disciplines. It's well accepted that the transformations wrought by industrial capitalism in 19th century Britain, and in particular growing official interest in the proliferating metropolitan underclass, had a profound effect on the development of asylums and the professionalisation of psychiatry. Urbanisation, mechanisation and their related social effects weakened communal bonds, increased poverty, time discipline and its demands, increasing rates of alcoholism and neurosyphilis, simultaneously decreased the capacity of families to care for insane family members, while also swelling the ranks of the insane in urban settings. This also produced new typologies of nervous disorder, such as railway spine and neurasthenia, as well as sociological accounts of the city as the site of new forms of nervous tension. These accounts emphasise speed and atomization. So Durkheim's notion of anomy was predicated on the breakdown of rules, disciplines and structures brought about by industrialisation and urbanisation. And Simmel's new metropolitan type of individuality was premised on the intensification of nervous stimulation, which results from the swift and uninterrupted change of outer and inner stimuli. Cognate discussions of capitalism's rationality also anticipate and reflect a psychologized and in a sense, for some commentators, a moralized interpretation of capitalist economies. So Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham conceived of exchange, capitalist exchange, as a sort of rational activity. And also Karl Marx regarded capitalists as practicing a kind of rationality in which their attitude towards the unceasing movement of profit-making made the capitalist, Marx said, a rational miser, and the miser merely a capitalist gone mad. While sceptical of Marx's stern economism, Max Weber also offered similar arguments in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, a psychologized, what I think can be read as a psychologized genealogy of capitalism, written in the wake of Weber's own nervous breakdown, which caused him to be institutionalized several times and at the age of 39 to resign his professorship at the University of Heidelberg. In the Protestant Ethic, he proposed that the Calvinist doctrine of predestination yoked sublimated spiritual terror to what he called an aesthetic compulsion to save, producing an ethos of self-consciously rational capitalism that promoted an exacting, steady, but also self-denying accumulation of profit that was central to early modern mercantile capitalism, and he argued that persisted as a kind of sublimated psychic residue in capitalism's industrial phase, which was also sustained by standardised routines and procedures that governed labour and investment. Now the story does get more Marxist, beginning in the 1920s and, arguably to some extent taking up Weber's mantle, theorising the production of this capitalist rationality and critiquing its pervasive effects was a central concern of Western Marxism, as its adherents sought to understand the aftermath of the revolution in Russia, as well as the failed revolutions in Central Europe and elsewhere. Here, what I'm going to call a kind of totalisation theme emerged, the effects of which were increasingly psychologized. So Lukács' influential concept of reification that sort of took Marx's notion of the fetishism of commodities and said that it could be applied not just to social relations, but to the whole consciousness of man, and that it would result in both the fragmentation of experience and the elevation of what he described as a phantom objectivity, an autonomy that seems so strictly rational and all-embracing as to conceal every trace of its fundamental nature, the relation between people. This writing, Lukács' work, was an important precursor to the theorists of the Frankfurt School, who were more deliberately looking beyond prevailing understandings of orthodox Marxism and towards psychoanalysis to expand the bounds of the political and to produce critical accounts of art, music, literature, and mass culture as emblematic of social relations under capitalism. With the rise of Nazism sending many key theorists into exile in the United States, these attempted conciliations of Freud and Marx also offered a means of comprehending the rise of fascism in interwar Europe and the cataclysm of the Second World War. While works like Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom and Theodor Adorno's The Authoritarian Personality offered explicitly psychologized accounts of fascism's malign appeal, other accounts advanced more encompassing theories that emphasise capitalism's hegemonic and thus totalising qualities, renderings that anticipate the kind of allo exploitation that Han invokes, and I think maybe give a bit of a gloss to his claim that his work is sort of an update. Maybe it's a kind of recursion or a re-excavation. In the Dialectic of Enlightenment in 1947, for example, Adorno, writing with Max Horkheimer, pointed to the triumph of pervasive instrumental reason as constraining the possibilities of human freedom and rationalising domination and exploitation so that subjects collude in their own oppression. Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, written in the mid-60s, also anticipated the contemporary characterisation of neoliberalism's totalising psychic effects by proposing that the central conundrum of leftist politics was, in the end, how to undo the subject's conquest of his or herself. Now, interestingly, or perhaps characteristically, I think there are many echoes of this totalisation theme that can also be heard in and around postmodern theory, though it's less explicit. Let's start with the obvious one, which is the project Capitalism and Schizophrenia, comprising the book Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus by the philosopher Deleuze and psychiatrist Felix Guattari. They proposed that humans were best understood as desiring machines, whose liberation could only be found in radical anti-identitarianism that amplified interconnections, contingencies, and flux, precepts that Guattari had sought to practice at the therapeutic community at Le Bord, where he had lived and worked since the 1950s. Yet while Deleuze and Guattari used psychologized language, the relationship between their analysis and actual clinical practice is not clear, in particular how the reader ought to understand their mobilisation of schizophrenia, the related schizoanalysis, and the relationship of these concepts to capitalism. Critics have repeatedly charged that, like some of the anti-psychiatrists, Deleuze and Guattari merely romanticise schizophrenia for rhetorical purposes. A counter-interpretation is that their intention is strictly metaphorical and that it underscores this cleaving of psi language that's used in the academy from its clinical origins. And arguably, we could also see this phenomenon, say, in Frederick Jameson's invocation of postmodernity's schizophrenic temporalities. And there are other examples. Regardless, what I think is interesting here is that they are purporting or seem to be describing an emergent form of capitalism that is globalised, borderless, forever circulating, forever territorialising individuals who can only resist via constant effortful acts of schizoanalytic destruction. And to me, that suggests, a totalisation of similar intensity to the formulations of the Frankfurt School and their predecessors, as well as a usefulness of capitalist psychopolitics in their universe as a means of illumination and critique. I don't have time to go into where I think there are also elements of this lineage and echoes again in affect theory. But if you think about Lauren Berlant's book, Cruel Optimism, and Setkowitz's Depression, A Public Feeling, and I would also argue the work of the British cultural critic Mark Fisher, I think there is this similar impulse taken up to a means of critiquing capitalism by looking at its psychic effects. And they often in their work provide a kind of bridge between the generalised and theoretical psychopolitics that I've outlined above, and they want to talk about how it produces specific expressions in the world of work. And in the digital realm in the case of Hahn, and I'm going to turn to both now. All right. As with the relationship between capitalism and the history of the asylum, work is relevant to the history of psychiatry in two broad senses. First, patient labour served important purposes within institutions, where it was understood as both discipline and as therapy, and where the capacity to work was also a barometer of patients' recovery. More tellingly, over the course of the 20th century, unemployment was also increasingly medicalised, so that chronic unemployment or underemployment or eccentric work histories might also be cast as a kind of psychopathology, an assumption with parallels in contemporary psychologized workfare regimes that critics, particularly in Britain, make. Alongside this tendency to regard work as a therapeutic good is also the history of the workplace itself as a quasi-clinical space in which workers, but also organisations themselves, were understood and managed in psychological terms. A leading example from the early 20th century is the field of industrial psychiatry, which rose to prominence in the interwar period and reflected new popular interest in psychodynamic theories, as well as an old tradition of factory medicine. While initially concerned with solving issues like absenteeism and industrial accidents, after the Second World War, this specialty began to address wider concerns like organisational performance by drawing on theories of interpersonal and group behaviour elaborated in wartime contexts. In the following decades, though, the shift from industrial to global consumer capitalism, the corresponding increase in people working in service roles rather than in factories, and arguably the decline of unions, turned the field away from groups and towards the individual employee as the object of psychologized care, but also surveillance. The emergence of human resource management, both as a discrete business function and as a field of expert knowledge, reflects these developments. Indeed, in many contemporary workplaces, HR specialists now manage both the administration of employees, so payroll, and functions like that, as well as various wellbeing initiatives that purport to safeguard employees' mental health. In addition, many large workplaces, including our own, also offer access to free or subsidised psychological counselling, employee benefits that recognise the prevalence of mental illness in the general population, but that also arguably provide moral cover for the kind of distress the workplace may generate. And I'll just note here, I'm sure all these things are well-intentioned, but in the literature that I'm about to talk about on burnout, the lunchtime yoga session is sort of this talisman of one of the sort of workplace wellbeing initiatives it's nice, provided you could get away from your desk, which you can't because you've got too much work on. Increasingly too, mental health is also grounds for criticism and resistance in the workplace. And I think that speaks to a tendency in the history of psychiatry when it can be used, it's mostly used by the powerful, but also as a form of resistance. In 2022, the International Labour Organization Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work added a fifth principle, a safe and healthy working environment, which has begun to be interpreted as requiring employers to protect workers' psychological health. Renewed interest in the notion of burnout. As we've seen, it's been used by Hahn to indicate neoliberalism's destructive effects, but also elaborated in various mainstream titles currently on the market, and I've put a few up there, speak to a similar tendency. Now, burnout has a telling history, which some of you will know about. It's got conceptual links to stress research, but also practical origins in the clinical counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s. In a 1974 paper that's generally credited with popularising or at least surfacing the concept, the psychologist Herbert J. Freudenberger argued that burnout was an occupational risk for those people who worked in alternative institutions, in free clinics, therapeutic communities, hotlines, crisis intervention centres, women's clinics, gay centres, runaway houses, all endeavours requiring substantial animating idealism and then sustained personal commitment despite endemic underfunding. According to Freudenberger, burnout often began with physical symptoms, and here you can start to check them off your bingo card. He identified a feeling of exhaustion and fatigue, being unable to shake a lingering cold, suffering from frequent headaches and gastrointestinal disturbances, sleeplessness and shortness of breath. Then came altered behaviour, angry outbursts, paranoia, risk-taking, depression, isolation. Those suffering from burnout, he said, had usually been working too much, too long and too intensely. And he thought that there was a physiological dimension, but there were psychological dynamics as well. High ideals followed by dashed hopes, as well as boredom once the crises of the early days were over, the heady early days were over. Now, in another familiar dynamic, and as I argue elsewhere, and people have argued elsewhere, with something like PTSD, which starts out as the very politicized post-Vietnam syndrome and becomes a disorder of general application, burnout was soon separated from its roots in the counterculture, so that by the 1980s, anyone, including those in white-collar employment, could burn out, and that included the dyspeptic executives who were overseeing it all. The political implications had shifted. Burnout was no longer about the stress of working with vulnerable people for little pay, but about employees' own vulnerabilities and their capacity to properly manage their workplace stress. Now, there's been recent and renewed interest in burnout that I have mentioned just before, and there is literature, I guess, on subtypes that people purport to have identified, particularly in professions most affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So health professionals, doctor burnout, physician burnout, nurse burnout, teacher burnout. And these sort of post-pandemic discussions may go some way to repoliticising the concept. Though whether this will result in lasting change is difficult to say, because almost by definition, burnout decimates the energy required for collective action. The term's imprecision also doesn't help. It's absent from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual because it's not sort of recognised as a discrete and real mental illness. But in 2019, a new expanded definition of burnout was added to the WHO's ICD volume 11 or iteration 11, which listed it as an occupational phenomenon rather than a medical condition, the result of chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed, although crucially it is not clear by who should be doing the managing. Is it the employer or the employee, his or herself? All right. Now I want to move on to talk a bit about the digital virtual realm and try and say again some vaguely sensible things about how the tendencies I've been talking about play out in a more contemporary framework. The digital, talking about the digital, of course, links to Hahn's articulation of what he describes as a digital psychopolitics that now sort of reigns over our lives. as well as other questions about the intersection of mental health, the market, and the digital sphere. These encompass both the possibilities of harm, which we would sort of know about those discussions. So things like, cyberbullying, the facilitation of porn and gambling addictions, the cumulative effects of constant connectivity or sustained immersion in social media. But there's also new therapeutic possibilities that are also open to monetisation. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated developments in digital mental health that had been brewing since the early 2000s, when it was recognised that these new technologies could improve the capacity of certain patients, those living remotely, with mobility issues, or with conditions that rendered them housebound, such as agoraphobia, to access mental health treatment. And post-pandemic, this imperative remains. The World Health Organization cites digital technologies as a means to extend mental health care for people in low and middle income countries, where smartphone ownership is increasing. And in the global north too, governments are also interested in expanding digital interventions to address service gaps without the need for costly spending on physical infrastructure and personnel. Predictably too, the private sector has a keen interest in these technologies. While generic wellness was already heavily monetised in online spaces, the pandemic disruptions and lockdowns supercharged demand for mental health services that could only be delivered remotely for a period. In 2021, investors channeled a reported $4.8 billion into digital mental health startups, many of them app-based ventures like BetterHelp, which focuses on online therapy, and Cerebral, which prescribes psychopharmaceuticals, but has recently branched out into online therapy as well. Now, of course, where I'm going with this, even newer technologies offer further possibilities for digital therapeutics. The public release of the ChatGPT platform in November 2022 has prompted renewed attention to the potential applications of artificial intelligence in psychiatry and related disciplines, interest that has been building for the last decade and is closely tied to developments in computational psychiatry. Whereas mental health apps seek to streamline patient-clinician interactions, advances in natural language processing, in machine learning, and in generative AI suggest three possibilities for the future of psychiatry. I'm not going to outline them all here in exhausting detail, but new models of explanation, new powers of prediction, and new capacities for automation. And these combine to suggest new possibilities for markets. So for reasons of time, I'm going to leave aside explanatory modelling and just note here that this proceeds, it seems to me, on an assumption that both normal and abnormal functioning can be modelled by applying statistical reasoning to hypothesised systems of brain functioning. And then the resulting models are used to provide mechanistic explanations for the production of psychiatric disorders. And proponents see this as a way to get round, I guess, the descriptive focus of a lot of psychiatric diagnoses, which has been a site of kind of tension and discontent for a long time. In contrast to explanatory models, predictive applications of these new technologies use machine learning techniques to process vast clinical data sets in order to refine diagnostic categories, theorise the relationship between symptoms, and predict treatment responses and other patient behaviours, ideally. Here, potential clinical applications are more immediately apparent. The existence of vast digitised data sets generated by activity on social media, in electronic health records, or the metrics produced by wearable technology, and now allow machine learning systems to run prediction algorithms with uses for both individual patients and, it is hoped, vulnerable cohorts. One possibility is that patients with bipolar disorder, for example, may be able to use such tools in consultation with their doctor to predict and manage the onset of a manic or depressive episode. So it's theorised that say the beginnings of sleep disturbance that an Apple Watch might pick up could be something that triggers, a doctor's visit and a review of medication. There's also a lot of interest in using such predictive systems to detect the onset of disordered language. that some theorists argue is characteristic of schizophrenia, the onset of schizophrenia. And there is also much hope that these techniques will be useful for suicide prevention, a long-time practical problem for clinicians, given the incentive for suicidal patients to conceal their intentions, and also a kind of conceptual problem in the sense that it has been difficult to write algorithms sensitive enough to predict statistically rare, though of course devastating events. Potential applications include better data gathering on attempted and completed suicides, the flagging of important socio-demographic factors such as community of residence. That seems to have come up in at least some of the literature because it may map to gun ownership as a potential risk factor, and the ability to practice more directed outreach. New suicide prevention measures have important implications for governments, given the politically sensitive issue of high suicide rates in the veteran community, and numbers that appear resistant to the many programs, resources, and other interventions aimed at destigmatising mental illness in the military. The United States Department of Veteran Affairs now uses a prediction algorithm to more closely monitor veterans deemed at the highest risk of suicide. All right, the final implication for AI in mental health relates to automation, and in particular automated therapy, which has loomed as a possibility since the mid-1960s when the MIT computer scientist Joseph Weizenbaum released the now famous ELIZA program, which decomposed text typed by a user and then reassembled it as a question or statement according to a set of predetermined rules. You can use ELIZA. There are versions on the internet. See how far you get. It resulted in human-machine conversations that approximated what Weizenbaum, who had been in therapy himself, described as a kind of non-directive psychotherapy. For Weizenbaum, these therapeutic encounters were one of the few examples of categorised dyadic natural language communication in which one of the participating pair is free to assume the pose of knowing almost nothing of the real world. This not knowingness was central to ELIZA's conversational style, which quickly became repetitive and circular, and they were characteristics that, to Weizenbaum, made ELIZA's limits abundantly clear. Other researchers, however, felt precisely the opposite, and that demonstrates, I think, the pull of these techniques in terms of scale and cost, as well as monetisation, potential monetisation. In the weeks before Weizenbaum's first ELIZA paper appeared, the Stanford psychiatrist Kenneth Mark Colby and his colleagues published an account of a similar program in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. The Stanford team had also, they said, written a computer program which can conduct psychotherapeutic dialogue, a system that was conceptually equivalent to ELIZA, but with the express purpose of eliciting a communicative experience intended to be therapeutic, they said. Although almost everyone who has participated in these dialogues reports that he comes to feel annoyed and frustrated by the program's responses, the Stanford team believed that with further refinement, the program might be useful, they said, for mental hospitals and psychiatric centres suffering a shortage of therapists. Indeed, the new time-sharing capacity of modern computers would allow several hundred patients an hour to undergo this kind of automated therapy, freeing up the human therapist to be a much more efficient man. For Colby, far from demonstrating the limits of such systems, human interactions with programs like ELIZA invoked a new therapeutic future in which the uncertainties of psychoanalysis, with which Colby had become disillusioned, would no longer intrude. Now, everyone's laughed, but just stay with me here. Weizenbaum was predictably critical of the notion of machine therapists, arguing that they could offer only impoverished forms of simulated care. And Colby, for his part, eventually acknowledged some of these qualms, albeit a bit elliptically. In a paper published in 1986, 20 years later, he implied that critics of computer-assisted psychotherapy had been attacking a straw man, invoking a dehumanised situation in which one might see a patient sitting alone in a room and interacting with a computer by means of a keyboard. This was not the intention, Colby insisted. Rather, computer-assisted psychotherapy would be a group exercise, something not apparent in the 1966 paper. In this collective format, groups of patients would sit in a room at their own computer terminal and interact with what he described as a therapeutic learning program, interspersed with discussions between the patient and a human therapist trained in carrying out the procedures of this method. The therapist would provide, he said, human elements of warmth, empathy, and humour and intuition considered desirable in the helping relationship of psychotherapy. And the presence of other patients would add further human qualities of group support and examples of similar problems. Now, several decades on from this clarification, Kolbe's version of automated therapy appears, at least to me, quaint and almost sweet in the context of our increasingly digitised lives. Given that many of us spend much of our time sitting alone in a room and interacting with a computer by means of a keyboard, it is not unreasonable to imagine that new generative AI platforms such as ChatGPT may soon become quite normalised as machine therapists, whether as text-based interfaces, disembodied voices, avatars, or embodied social robots. If our reflexive response is like Weizenbaum's, we will dismiss these versions, both the free and no doubt the paid versions, as poor imitations of the humankind, the predictable outcome of psychiatry conducted for quick profit and at scale. Yet it's worth pausing to consider just what constitutes good therapy. The history of psychiatric treatment, I think, offers no easy answers here, since one of its paradoxes seems to be that at least some of the time for some patients, what helps one might hurt another. For some patients, it may be precisely a chatbot's non-humanness, that not knowingness that Weizenbaum talked about, the fact that a chatbot neither judges nor cares, that imparts therapeutic effects. Indeed, some researchers suggest that chatbots could be valuable early screening tools for groups hesitant to disclose mental health concerns to human clinicians, such as military serving personnel. Now, of course, there are ethical implications to therapy completely stripped of human judgment. I'm not necessarily advocating for this, but what I think it indicates more broadly is the ambivalence that underwrites what the sociologist Sherry Turkle called the ELISA effect, our propensity to humanise technologies like Weizenbaum's ELISA program. As we interact with these systems, we become more adept at recognising their limitations. But then this comfort produces first legitimation and then normalisation. And in the case of ELISA, users' enthusiasm reflected their perception that psychotherapy had become more cognitive and scientific. And I think it's reasonable to assume that new AI-enabled technologies will be subject to a similar process. All right, to conclude, the history of psychiatry offers examples of the way the market shapes therapeutic spaces and can herald both austerity and largesse. In the private madhouses of 18th century Britain, in the popularity of private psychotherapy in post-war United States, in the justifications for deinstitutionalisation in Britain, in the pharmaceutical companies' ceaseless search for new markets, in venture capital's interest in the possibilities of online therapy, the market delineates and clarifies therapeutic possibilities. Thus, while it is likely that this newer, faster, more automated digital world might democratise some elements of the mental health landscape, it's also possible, maybe it's likely, that it will radically stratify others, as much as, I can say that as a historian. I want to finish with a very recent example. Around this time last year, researchers at the University of Texas reported that they had developed a non-invasive brain-computer interface capable of acting as a personalised language decoder, and one able to infer the meaning, they said, of perceived speech, imagined speech, and even silent videos from an individual's fMRI imaging. This system used a predictive model trained on hours of an individual's fMRI data collected while the research subject lay in the machine and listened to podcasts and watched animated films. Provided such systems have access to sufficient training data, and insofar as thoughts can be correlated with brain activity that then map to inner speech, and I think that's a far from settled question, it may indeed be possible to reconstruct something approximating an individual's silent thoughts, so a kind of mind reading. These are extraordinary findings with significant implications, wonderful implications for patients suffering speech deficits due to brain injuries and other conditions, whose best options currently are surgically implanted devices, although these increasingly leverage AI capabilities. Yet it is also not difficult to think of potential mental health applications of such a brain-computer interface. For example, the way it might override or get round a complete reliance on a clinician's interpretation of a patient's self-report, especially when combined with the explanatory and predictive functions of the computational psychiatry I described earlier. Yet in typifying the possibilities of intensely personalised medicine, such technology also raises disquieting questions about accessibility and monetisation, as well as what researchers describe as mental privacy. In the University of Texas study, the research subjects were able to resist the interface by silently performing tasks in an idiosyncratic or unpredictable manner, suggesting that cooperation is necessary to produce a truly accurate decoder for any individual. But given creations often run ahead of their creators, one could easily imagine a more sinister scenario in which such nuance is discarded and brain-computer interfaces become a new kind of polygraph test, calibrated to a notional baseline with deviations from that baseline pathologized and monetized. Even the more trivial applications may end up fueling new kinds of therapies or reanimating old ones. Perhaps the billionaires who today fly to space will tomorrow sleep in brain scanners that record their dreams and so resurrect the dream interpretation of the psychoanalysts. In offering up the brain to the market, such dreams and nightmares coexist. And I'll leave it there.
Wow. Gosh, thank you so much, Libby. Incredibly rich and so many things to think about. I have a question, but I'm going to open up first because that's what the chair should do. So would anyone like to start us off? And we have about just under 15 minutes for some questions. Is there anybody on Zoom who'd like to make a sound or appear for us in this room? Okay, David, thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious you didn't mention the phenomenon of deinstitutionalization as part of increasing, well, I guess what you call capitalist progress. Could you comment on that, please?
Sorry, David, I just missed the beginning. You said deinstitutionalization.
You didn't mention deinstitutionalization, which started in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
A very important turnaround in psychiatric care, I guess.
I agree, and thanks for the question. So a very interesting question, a very interesting phenomenon. Interested to hear what other people think about this, but it's always struck me that, you know, here is an instance where a lot of trends coalesce, and the political explanation for deinstitutionalization can be quite seemingly contradictory. So I do think in Britain there is an austerity argument. It's a conservative government that is sort of in favour of implementing deinstitutionalization, not because they see necessarily institutions as sort of authoritarian, total institutions along the critiques of the anti-psychiatrists, but because they want to save money. In the States, I think it's slightly different. There is a moral argument that is marshalled around, some key figures in the counterculture who argue that these are dehumanizing institutions that need to be closed, and there will be money provided and people can live in the community. I also don't think, the explanation for deinstitutionalization is completely separable from the advent of antipsychotics and what that was at least doing to the notion or people's understanding of what, I guess, schizophrenia was and what it meant for people to live with that disorder. But I agree with you that, political economy and deinstitutionalization is very intertwined.
Thank you.
Can I ask you about privacy? So towards the end, you start talking about privacy a bit more in terms of digital applications. But going back to the beginning of the asylum and the hospital for the insane, people being committed kind of with shame or a stigma associated, so it's very private, it's hidden away. And then going on the back of that question, there's an opening up and there's an embracing of understanding mental illness, madness. And now we're back into this kind of phase where we're potentially thinking about more and more privatisation of mental health and care, but yet that data could be made public. It's subject to data breaches. So what do we do with this question? It's like, I'm sorry, a ramble, but a privacy question.
Well, I mean, maybe the best comment that I can make is there is a whole sort of ethical literature that is around this, both to do with saying in the question, that question of the suicide prevention question, where say in the VA they're running these algorithms and generating a list of people essentially that they're then going out and sort of like an assertive outreach. And there's a bit of concern about, well, could that have perverse effects? Someone's feeling fine and suddenly they get a call from the VA saying, like, are you okay? Because we're worried about you. So there's that sort of thing about the ethics of sort of doing that assertively. But yeah, then in terms of the safety of this data, who owns the data? Who should get access to electronic health records? But also, who owns the data on your heart rate? That your Apple Watch or your Garmin is generating, I think is very interesting. And then, of course, this question about mental privacy when it comes to brain computer interfaces as well.
So the question of privacy sort of weaves its way right through the psychopolitics, doesn't it?
It does, and I think one of the broader points that a lot of commentators make about mental health that I find extremely interesting, I don't know if other people agree, is that for all the anti-stigma campaigns, people still argue that there is still a sort of impediment because the idea that we have about mental health, it's so amorphous that it doesn't necessarily leave space for people to admit to certain kinds of symptoms and behaviours. It's almost got this sort of aesthetic effect, and so safeguarding people's privacy remains incredibly important because I don't know that I don't know that there's still space for people who want that sort of thing. No, also in the workplace, that's another interesting question.
I guess I was just going to add on to that. I guess with increasing surveillance, it's almost like you're talking about the end, and it's such an incredible speech. Thank you. But it made me think of the panopticon. This is like over dominion of people's minds, and the privacy debate also weaves in with who's responsible. In the case of burnout, is it the individual's responsibility to manage their own mental health, which is, that very neoliberal concept, but it's almost like juxtaposed with, no, it's the organization's responsibility to manage their own, mental health, and then
I do.
Organizations.
I could be overthinking this. I do think there's a repoliticization of burnout. I feel like people are using it, and I think it's probably a pandemic effect to sort of say, this is something that has been done to me. It's not because I am bad at managing my time, and that was sort of the way it was used, at least in some way in the 70s. It was like, this is a function of working in these intense therapeutic spaces, and then it sort of became more amorphous. I don't know if it's being repoliticized again. I think we see this as well with, say, something like PTSD. Starts as post-Vietnam syndrome. It's like these are anti-war clinicians arguing for this syndrome. Becomes PTSD, which is a disorder of general application. And then in the 2010s, we see like moral injury, which is almost similar to post-Vietnam syndrome. It's like a repoliticization because people want to capture sort of this other dimension to it. It's not just biomedical. It's something more.
So, look, there are so many different aspects to this paper that I'm having trouble seeing your overall argument. You've got the evolution of therapeutic drugs. You've got the evolution and changing attitudes and therapies itself. You've got the individual with mental health problems stuck in the mix. You've got governments and you've got the capitalist system. Is your argument then that somehow the governments and the capitalist system are somehow in collusion with drug companies to manipulate or at least exploit individuals with mental health problems? Is that?
No, I think that would be that would be childish. No, I mean, I think what I'm trying to do in the longer version of the paper is say, all right, I think there is this lineage of people using psychiatry, psychiatric concepts about mental health to critique capitalism. And then there is a sort of a version of that where people apply it to the workplace or start to critique the workplace on those grounds. And also in the digital world, there is, I suppose, the possibility of how does a capitalist logic, or how could it monetize the digital? I don't know that collusion is the right word. I mean, there's opportunities, I suppose, but I don't think I see it in those terms as a sort of a conscious project.
Okay, I don't want to take.
That's right. I'll talk to you later.
You can explain sort of that.
Kathy's got a question, but I mean, just the way I was listening to it is around an intellectual history or a history of ideas that helps us make sense of some of these kinds of big questions in the history of psychiatry. I mean, yeah, that's just.
Yeah, we could say. I'll write that down. Let me write that down.
I was thinking about governments as well. I was thinking, because you brought up the example of soldiers, and with soldiers more than maybe in other cases, you see it said out loud, that connection between recovery and the nation state. And I was just thinking to myself, all of this, what is this all in aid of, you know? What's the end goal? Is to save time, to save money, yes, to gain individual wealth, but also to essentially run a successful nation state and a settler colonial state in the case of countries like Australia. And I wonder if that's said out loud very much.
Yes, I think it is. And I think mental health, like the actual concept of mental health, it takes the baton from mental hygiene for a bunch of reasons at the end of the Second World War, mental health. And it's very much conceived of as it's like a public health initiative, a public health good that is tied to sort of that post-war settlement, getting people back to work in as breadwinners, as employees, and those sorts of things. So yes, I would agree with you. I think the world wars, but particularly the Second World War, absolutely accelerate this tendency. And yes, of course, it serves governments and it serves workplaces if we think we're all responsible for our own mental health completely. And it's a biomedical phenomenon as well.
I think there's a really interesting shift there, perhaps from bodies to minds, and maybe you're all across this, but I was just thinking when you were talking about, putting the onus on the worker to keep themselves safe from burnout. Me looking at BHP in the 1920s, they were signs all over the workplace, putting the onus on the worker to keep themselves physically safe. You are the only one who can prevent accidents, things like that. Really overtly, it's on you. We created a really dangerous place here, but you're the one who has to be able to survive it. And it seems to me that shifts from it's the same shift that happens. So now in the physical workplace, there's all kinds of requirements that a safe workplace, physically safe workplace is provided, and it is the responsibility of the employer if accidents occur. And so it's the same shift that's happening. But similarly with sort of eugenics and the idea that you would get rid of defectives by preventing their reproduction after the Second World War, that's not really on anymore in the same way. You have to focus on, in repair of the mind. Yeah. So I just think there's some really interesting parallels there, perhaps, and an overall shift away from the physical body.
I would agree, and I would say it's probably not the mind anymore. It's the brain, the body, mind, brain. Although I think there is a kind of woolliness about the way we talk about the brain. I think we use it in two senses as a sort of synonym for mind sometimes.
Yeah, one more question, I think, then we'll have to finish.
You covered, it's very interesting, you've covered huge social change over 2 centuries or so. Industrialisation, changing work, globalisation, all of which, if you were writing a history just of those, would have a gender aspect. And yet in all these theories that theorists you've been discussing, I didn't hear anything about gender. And I was wondering if anybody has sort of put that variable in along with all the others.
So great question. Interesting. Why did I do this? Interesting. Pulling stuff out to try and get it to time. So yes. So gender, particularly, thinking about the digital stuff, vulnerability of young women, hypothesized for various reasons, to do with social media. Also, I guess feminist critiques of psychiatry in the 60s and 70s, I think are important here. They have a critique of capitalism as well. I mean, I would just note, and it occurred to me as I was saying it out loud, that the theorists do write the subject he. So I think that the male worker is probably the focus of a lot of these discussions.
Well, I think that
I'd be interested to.
Well, the move from the male breadwinner to the two-income family is a big social change in the advanced, if you like, industrial countries.
That's right, and I mean there are theories.
Does it have a connection to the theories?
No, they do. So well, and not in this paper, but say prescribing rates. So the advent of SSRIs and other sort of anti-anxiety, anti-depression medication. I mean, there's a theory that these are prescribed to women at increasing rates, not just because of the bored housewife stereotype of the 50s and 60s, but because of something to do with the stress of both domestic labour and working as well. So Peter Kramer's listening to Prozac. I mean, that was one of his big contentions, that women wanted to be prescribed these drugs because it allowed them to be sort of super women and able to compete in the 1990s sort of globalized capitalist economy. So there's an interesting story about the development of psychopharmaceutics. I don't mean that normatively. I just mean that that's a theory that's out there. But then conversely, we also know that men suffer terribly from mental health problems and sort of have trouble accessing care as well.
So, look, I think we need to get Libby's book. It's called No Mental Health, A Critical History.
It's boring.
2024.
It's really boring.
It's not, and it's you've actually, because it's a huge terrain of literature and scholarship now, we know it's massive, so you've really got a lot to contend with there. So thanks so much, Libby. Well done. And just before everybody goes, Sasha has asked me to say that our next paper is on Friday the 10th of May at 10 a.m, but online only. And our speaker is from Florida State University. Nilay Ozok Gundogan will present on the beginning of the end game, the road to the 1895 Armenian massacres in Ottoman Palau. And I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce the name correctly. We hope to see you there. Thank you.